The air in the private suite was thick with the scent of Frank's desperation and cheap bourbon. Vivian sat like a statue of polished obsidian, her hands folded in her lap, watching her marriage dissolve into a pile of losing chips. She had seen the numbers before they even hit the table. She knew the house was bleeding him dry, but Frank was deaf to logic. "One more round," Frank rasped, his eyes bloodshot as the table went cold. "You've got nothing left, go home," the dealer sneered. "Unless you're putting the wife on the felt." The room erupted in cruel laughter. Vivian felt the world tilt as Frank looked at her, not with love, but with the cold calculation of a man selling a used car. "She's a genius," they say. "Maybe she can bring a spark to your boring life." "No deal," he said. "I have a dozen beautiful and smart women." The opponent laughed and walked away, disgusted. But from the shadows, Silas Vane, a billionaire mafia boss, a man whose name was whispered like a curse, stood up. He walked to Vivian, his presence a heavy, commanding weight. He didn't look at Frank, he looked only at her. "I'll take that bet," Silas rumbled. He held out 2 ivory dice to Vivian. "But the house needs a blessing." "Kiss them, and let's see if your husband's luck has finally run out," Silas whispered, leaning close enough for her to smell his leather and sandalwood. He held out the dice as he whispered to her ear. "If you want a new life, Vivian, kiss these. Choose your fate. He doesn't value a beautiful and smart lady like you, but I do, which is why I stepped up to the challenge." Vivian felt the weight of her father's expectations and the years of Frank's emotional abuse. She looked at the dice, then at Silas's steady hands. She leaned in, her lips grazing the cold bone, then she looked at Frank, who was nodding eagerly for her to do it. She leaned in, her lips grazing the cold bone of the dice. She didn't pray for Frank to win. She prayed for the mafia boss to take her away. The dice tumbled. Frank lost. And for the first time in 3 years, Vivian smiled. This was just the beginning.
Before we continue, we welcome you to AFRO-KOREAN love thrillers, the home of dark romance, forbidden passion, power, betrayal, and captivating revenge stories. Please do me a favor. Tap that comment section and tell us quickly where you are watching from. Stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new thriller that drops here. Sit back and relax because this story is just getting started. Now let's get back to our story.
The underbelly was not a place for the faint of heart or the pure of soul. Tucked beneath a nondescript warehouse in downtown Los Angeles, it was a cathedral of vice where the air tasted of sulfur, expensive cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. At the center of this den sat the Lion's Circle, a baccarat table reserved for those who viewed 7-figure sums as pocket change. Frank leaned over the green felt, his movements jerky and frantic. 2 hours ago he had been a god, now he was a man watching his skin burn. He had arrived with $2 million of his father's solidification, funds, and a streak of luck that felt like destiny. But luck is a fickle mistress in the underbelly. It had seduced him, led him to the edge of the cliff, and then stepped aside. "Banker wins," the dealer intoned, his voice as dry as bone. Frank's hand shook as he reached for his whiskey. The $2 million was gone. The title to his Mercedes was gone. Even the gold watch his father had given him for his wedding, a marriage Frank treated like a prison sentence, was now sitting in the dealer's tray. Standing 3 feet behind him, Vivian was a study in obsidian elegance. At 25, she possessed a quiet, mathematical brilliance that Frank had never bothered to notice. To him, she was just the business merger his father had forced upon him, a beautiful, submissive accessory. But as Vivian watched the cards, her mind was moving at light speed, calculating the deck's variance. She saw the trap Frank was falling into, but she remained silent, bound by the cultural duty that had placed her in this nightmare. "You're cleaned out, Frank," his opponent, a greasy developer named Miller, chuckled. He stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked at Vivian with a sneer. "You've lost everything except the girl, and honestly, I don't have need of her. I have too many women already. She's worthless to me." Frank's head snapped up. The humiliation of being called broke stung, but the prospect of going home empty-handed was a death sentence. His eyes landed on Vivian. He didn't see his wife, he saw a chip. "Wait," Frank rasped, calling Miller back. "One more round, I'll bet her. I hear she's a genius. Maybe she can bring a spark to your boring life." A sickening silence fell over the room. Vivian felt the air leave her lungs. The betrayal wasn't just in the bet, it was in the word worthless. Tears pricked her eyes, shimmering against her dark skin like diamonds. "I won't play for her," Miller said, turning to leave. But a new voice, deep and resonant like the tolling of a heavy bell, cut through the room. "I will." From the shadows of the back corner, Silas Vane stepped into the light. The room seemed to shrink in his presence. He was the undisputed king of the LA shadows, a man who didn't gamble on cards, but on souls. He walked to the table, ignoring the frantic Frank, and fixed his gaze on Vivian. "I will play for her," Silas repeated, his eyes locked on hers. "But the dice need a witness." The tension in the lion's circle was thick enough to choke the life out of a man. Every eye in the underbelly was fixed on Silas Vane. He didn't move with the frantic energy of a gambler. He moved with the steady, terrifying patience of a glacier. He stopped inches from Vivian, his custom-tailored suit casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Frank's small, shivering frame. "Silas, Mr. Vane," Frank stammered, his eyes lighting up with a pathetic, renewed hope. "She's a prize, I promise, brilliant, submissive, she'll do whatever you—" "Quiet," Silas rumbled, not once breaking eye contact with Vivian. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 ivory dice, their surfaces polished to a mirror sheen. He didn't hand them to the dealer. Instead, he stepped closer to Vivian, invading her personal space until she could smell the complex notes of his leather cologne. He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear, his voice a vibration that sent a shockwave through her spine. "Your husband thinks you are a currency," Silas whispered, his tone devoid of the cruelty that filled the rest of the room. "But I see the architect behind your eyes. I will win this hand, Vivian, but only if you choose to be one. Kiss the dice. Give me your luck, and I will give you the world he tried to sell." Vivian looked at Frank. He was nodding at her, his face twisted in a mask of greedy encouragement. "Do it, Vive. Kiss 'em. This is it, our big break." At that moment, the final thread of Vivian's submissiveness snapped. She realized that Frank didn't just want to win, he wanted to be rid of her. He had called her worthless to a room full of jackals. She looked back at Silas. In his gray, storm-cloud eyes, she didn't see a master, she saw an exit. Vivian reached out, her fingers grazing Silas's warm hand as she steadied the dice. She leaned in, her red-painted lips lingering on the cold ivory. She didn't pray for a miracle for Frank. She whispered a silent goodbye into the bone. Silas straightened up and tossed the dice onto the felt. They skipped and danced, the sound like the clicking of a countdown. 1-1, snake eyes. The lowest possible roll, but in this specific game of sudden death stakes, it was exactly what Silas needed to trap Frank's overextended bet. "The house takes the girl," the dealer announced. The color drained from Frank's face. He let out a strange, high-pitched laugh that quickly turned into a sob. "Wait, no, that's not right. It was just one hand. Silas, let's go again. I can get the money from my father." Silas didn't look back. He simply placed his heavy black overcoat over Vivian's shoulders, the weight of it feeling like armor. "The debt is settled, Frank. You told the room she was worthless. You should have checked the math. She's the only thing of value you ever had." As Silas led her toward the exit, Vivian felt a strange, cold peace. She didn't look back at the man she had married. She looked at the heavy iron doors ahead. The heavy oak doors of the lion's circle hissed shut, cutting off the rhythmic clatter of chips and the low hum of desperation. The hallway was a stark contrast to the velvet heat of the den, cool, lit by recessed floor lights that turned the polished marble into a dark, frozen lake. Silas kept his hand on the small of Vivian's back. It wasn't the grip of a captor. It was the steadying presence of a man navigating a storm. Vivian felt the silk lining of his overcoat against her bare skin, a phantom shield against the shame still burning in her chest. "Wait, Mr. Vane. Silas, hold on." The frantic scuffle of dress shoes on marble echoed behind them. Frank burst through the doors, his tuxedo jacket hanging off his frame, his face a blotchy mess of sweat and tears. He wasn't running to save her. He was running to close a deal. Silas stopped, but he didn't turn around. He stood as still as a monolith. "You have 30 seconds, Frank. Make them count." Frank skidded to a halt. Gasping for air, he looked at Vivian, but his eyes didn't hold an ounce of regret. He looked at her as if she were a piece of equipment he'd just handed over. "Look, I know the bet was for her. Freedom or whatever," Frank panted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you heard me back there. She's a genius. Her father and my father, they've got this high-frequency trading algorithm she built. It's worth tens of millions. I'm the only one who knows the access codes. If I give you the codes, can we call the debt even? Maybe I can get a little finder's fee to get back on my feet." Vivian felt a cold shiver of disgust. He wasn't just gambling with her body anymore. He was trying to sell her mind to the very man who now owned her. The submissive daughter her parents had raised wanted to scream, but the architect in her brain was already 3 steps ahead. She knew Frank didn't have the codes. He had never been smart enough to find where she'd hidden them. Silas finally turned. The look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was pure, unadulterated loathing. He stepped toward Frank, and the air seemed to leave the hallway. "You bet your wife because you were too small to face your losses," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "And now you want a commission for your betrayal." "It's just business," Frank cried, stepping back. "She's my wife, I have the right to." Before Frank could finish, Silas's hand shot out, his fingers closing around Frank's throat with the speed of a viper. He lifted the man until his toes barely grazed the marble. "You have the right to be silent," Silas hissed. He reached into Frank's inner pocket, pulled out the blue passport Frank had been clutching, and tossed it to one of the 2 silent enforcers who had appeared from the shadows. "She is no longer your wife. She is no longer your spark. You are a ghost, Frank. If I see you in this city tomorrow, I'll make sure the ghost becomes a corpse." Silas dropped him like a bag of trash. Frank crumpled, gasping and clutching his throat. Silas turned back to Vivian. For a brief moment, the ice in his gaze thawed as he looked at her. "He's right about one thing, isn't he? You are a genius, but he was wrong about the codes. You didn't give them to him, did you?" Vivian straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze. "He couldn't even find the door to the room where I keep them." Silas smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression of respect. "Good. Let's go home, Vivian. We have an empire to restructure." The drive to Silas Vane's estate was conducted in a silence that felt heavy yet oddly liberating. Vivian watched the neon blur of the Sunset Strip fade into the dark, winding canyons of the Hollywood Hills. For years, she had lived in a house that felt like a waiting room, a space she occupied only to serve Frank's ego and her parents' expectations. Now, she was entering a fortress. The estate sat at the very crest of a ridge, a masterpiece of glass, black steel, and jagged stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. When the iron gates hissed shut behind the Bentley, Vivian felt a physical snap, the final severing of her ties to the world that had tried to break her. Silas led her through a foyer that looked more like a museum than a home. "You were expecting a dungeon, perhaps?" he asked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I was expecting a master," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. Silas stopped and turned to her. He didn't loom over her this time. He stepped back, giving her space. "I have plenty of people to take orders from me, Vivian. I didn't bring you here to add to that number. I brought you here because I'm tired of being surrounded by idiots who think luck is something you pray for." He led her into a room that took her breath away. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a command center. One wall was entirely glass, overlooking the glittering carpet of Lowe's Angels. The other was a floor-to-ceiling library of leather-bound books and cutting-edge server racks that hummed with a low, blue light. In the center sat a massive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. On the desk was a high-end laptop and a crystal glass of deep red wine. "Your husband thought he was selling a spark," Silas said, gesturing toward the desk. "I think he was selling the sun. My financial infrastructure is being bled by a dozen small leaks I can't find. My logistics are a mess of old-world habits. I don't want a trophy, Vivian. I want an architect." Vivian walked toward the desk, her fingers grazing the cool obsidian. She looked at the laptop. The login screen was already up, but it wasn't a password prompt. It was a complex string of encrypted code, a test. She sat down, the midnight velvet of the chair molding to her frame. Without a word, her fingers began to fly across the keys. The rhythm was hypnotic, a staccato dance that spoke of years of suppressed genius finally finding an outlet. Silas watched her from the shadows, his arms crossed. He didn't see a submissive wife or a discarded woman. He saw a predator finding her teeth. Within 90 seconds, the encryption broke. A map of Silas's global holdings flooded the screens, a chaotic web of numbers and routes that would have made a normal person dizzy. Vivian scanned the data, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the monitors. "Your third-party shipping in the port of Long Beach is being ghosted by a shell company," she said, her voice dropping into the cold, clinical tone of the genius she was. "And your offshore accounts in the Caymans have a backdoor entry that's been open for 6 months. Frank didn't just skim from you, Silas. He left the lights on for everyone else to do it, too." Silas stepped into the light, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "And can you close the door?" Vivian looked up at him, the red wine catching the light in her hand. "I can do more than close it. I can make sure anyone who tries to knock on it again loses their hand." For the first time since she arrived in America, Vivian wasn't a daughter or a wife. She was the ghost in the machine. For the next 10 days, Vivian became a phantom within the walls of the Vane estate. She barely slept, fueled by a potent cocktail of espresso and the intoxicating high of absolute intellectual freedom. Silas gave her total autonomy. He watched as the woman who had arrived in tears transformed into a digital general, her sharp bob reflecting the cool glare of multiple monitors as she dismantled the old guard of his empire. She didn't just fix the leaks, she re-engineered the flow. Using a modified version of the chaos theory algorithm she had originally built for her father's firm, she created a neural web that monitored Silas's assets in real time. "You've increased the efficiency of the Mediterranean routes by 22% in 72 hours, Silas remarked, leaning against the doorframe one evening. He was holding 2 plates of jollof rice, a silent nod to her heritage that made her heart skip a beat. "My captains are calling me, asking who the new oracle is." Vivian didn't look up from the screen. "Tell them it's the ghost of Christmas future. And tell your head of security, Marco, that his discrepancies in the warehouse payroll have been flagged. I've frozen his personal accounts." Silas chuckled, a dark, appreciative sound. "You're making me a very rich man, Vivian, but you're also making a lot of enemies." "Good," she replied, finally turning the chair to face him. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of the submissive fog that had clouded them for years. "Enemies are predictable. It's friends you have to worry about, like Frank." "He's been quiet," Silas noted, setting the food down. "Hiding in a hole in Van Nuys." "He's not hiding," Vivian corrected, a cold smile playing on her lips. "He's trying to sell the black box. He thinks he can bypass my encryption by selling the physical hardware to the Morty family." Silas's expression darkened. The Mortys were the only rivals with enough muscle to challenge him. "He has the hardware." "He has a decoy," Vivian said, taking a bite of the rice. "I knew he'd try to steal from me the moment he felt the walls closing in. I left a drive in our old safe. It looks like my primary algorithm, but it's a Trojan horse. The moment they plug it into a high-security server, it won't give them my data. It will give me theirs." She looked at Silas, the blue light of the servers framing her like a halo. "Frank thinks he's playing for his life. He doesn't realize he's just the delivery boy for my takeover of the Morty network." Silas walked over and placed a hand on the desk, inches from hers. The respect in his gaze was heavy, almost physical. "You didn't just kiss the dice that night, did you? You'd already rigged the game before you even walked into the casino." Vivian leaned back, her voice a melodic whisper of power. "I've been rigging the game since the day I realized my husband was a fool. I just needed a partner with enough weight to help me move the pieces." As the sun began to set over the Hollywood Hills, the first tremors of Vivian's earthquake began to vibrate through the Chicago and LA underworlds. The silent architect was no longer silent. Frank's world smelled of stale cigarettes and the damp rot of a $12-a-night motel in Van Nuys. The lucky streak he had bragged about was now a distant, mocking memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Vivian's lips grazing those ivory dice, a kiss that had acted as a death warrant for his old life. "It's not my fault," he muttered to the cracked ceiling, clutching a silver flash drive like a holy relic. "She's the one who held out on me. She's the one who played me." His entitlement was the only thing keeping him from total collapse. He had convinced himself that Vivian owed him this. If she wouldn't be his wife, she would be his currency. He had managed to contact a mid-level broker for the Morty family, promising them the black box, the high-frequency algorithm that had made his father a titan in Lagos. He didn't know how it worked, but he knew the Mortys would kill to own it. The meeting took place in the back of a shuttered auto shop. Two men in sharp, charcoal suits stood by a flickering industrial lamp. "You have the drive?" one of them asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I have it," Frank said, his voice cracking. 10 million, half now, half when you see it works, and I want a plane ticket out of the country, tonight." The Morty enforcer took the drive and plugged it into a ruggedized laptop. Frank watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He imagined the look on Silas Vane's face when he realized his prize had been hollowed out from the inside. He imagined the look on Vivian's face when she realized she was back in a cage, just a different one. The screen flickered. A progress bar crawled across the display. 10%, 40%, 80%. "Wait," the enforcer frowned. "This isn't a financial ledger, it's a video file." The screen turned pitch black, and then a face appeared. It wasn't the face of the submissive wife Frank had known. It was Vivian. She was sitting in a high-back leather chair, the glow of Silas's penthouse reflected in the cold, dark depths of her eyes. "Hello, Frank," her voice echoed through the garage, crystal clear and chillingly calm. "I knew you'd go to the Mortys. You always were predictable. You go where you think the power is, never realizing that power is something you build, not something you steal." The Morty enforcers reached for their weapons, but Vivian continued, her voice holding them in place. "To the gentlemen in the suits, by the time you hear this, the drive has already uploaded a worm into your private server. Every offshore account linked to the Morty name is currently being liquidated and moved to a trust in my name. Frank didn't bring you a weapon. He brought you a parasite." Frank's knees buckled. No, that's not possible. She's lying." On the screen, Vivian leaned forward, her gaze piercing through the lens, straight into Frank's soul. "You called me worthless, Frank. You said I was dirt beneath your foundation. Now look at you. You've betrayed the only woman who loved you, and you've insulted the only men who could protect you. You aren't a gambler, Frank. You're the house that just burned down." The screen went dark. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the Morty enforcer cocking his pistol. He looked at Frank with a mixture of pity and pure, lethal rage. "You brought us a virus, kid," the enforcer whispered. "I didn't know, I swear," Frank screamed, backing into a stack of old tires. "It doesn't matter what you knew," the enforcer said. "What matters is what she knows, and she knows your dead weight." Frank scrambled for the back door, bursting out into the rainy LA night. He was running, but for the first time, he realized there was nowhere to go. The worthless girl was now the hunter, and the entire city was her trap. The Beverly Hills estate of the British consul was a sea of white marble, flowing champagne, and the kind of wealth that didn't just talk, it dictated terms. This was the Gala of Ghosts, the annual gathering where the city's legitimate titans rubbed shoulders with the shadow kings of the underworld. Frank stood at the edge of the ballroom, hiding behind a massive floral arrangement. He was disheveled, his suit rumpled from 3 nights of sleeping in his car, his eyes darting frantically. He had spent his last $100 bribing a server for a uniform jacket, desperate to find his father. Chief Ademi was here, visiting from Lagos, and he was Frank's only hope for survival. "There he is," Frank whispered, spotting his father across the room, resplendent in a deep purple agbada, surrounded by a circle of laughing dignitaries. But as Frank moved toward him, the music shifted. The orchestra transitioned into a slow, commanding cello arrangement. The double doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open, and the chatter of 500 people died instantly. Silas Vane stepped into the light. He looked every bit the Dark Emperor, but tonight, he was merely the frame for the masterpiece on his arm. Vivian descended the stairs with the poise of a deity. She wore a custom fusion gown, a sleek, floor-length silhouette of liquid black silk draped with a traditional Nigerian ipple made of shimmering gold thread. Her hair was a sharp, lethal bob, and her neck was adorned with a choker of black diamonds that looked like captured midnight. "Is that Vivian?" the whisper rippled through the crowd. She didn't look like the shy, submissive daughter who had left Nigeria 2 years ago. She looked like the woman who owned the room. Beside her, Silas didn't lead. He walked half a step behind her, an intentional gesture of deference that sent shockwaves through the gathered elite. Frank watched, paralyzed. The worthless cargo was now the queen of the West Coast. Vivian's eyes scanned the room, landing on Chief Ademi. She guided Silas toward him. Frank's father, a man who usually demanded a bow from everyone, stepped forward and took Vivian's hand, kissing her knuckles with genuine respect. "Vivian, my daughter," Ademi boomed, his voice carrying. "I have heard of the Oracle taking over the LA markets. I did not realize my own daughter-in-law was the one outperforming my entire board of directors." "I am no longer your daughter-in-law, Chief," Vivian said, her voice clear and carrying across the silent ballroom. "I am your partner, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I have acquired the majority stake in the Lagos LA trade merger." Frank chose that moment to stumble out from the shadows. Father, she's a thief. She's with him, she's with the Mafia, she stole the algorithm." The crowd gasped. Security moved in, but Silas raised a hand, stopping them. He wanted the room to see this. Vivian turned to look at the man who had traded her for a pair of deuces. She didn't look angry. She looked like a scientist observing a particularly pathetic specimen under a microscope. "Frank," she said softly, "you look tired. Perhaps you should go back to the motel. I believe the Morty family is still looking for you to discuss that Trojan horse you delivered." Chief Ademi looked at his son, the sweat, the desperation, the cowardice, and then at Vivian, who stood with the weight of an empire behind her. He turned to Silas. "Mr. Vane, I believe my son has overstayed his welcome in your city, and in my family." The chief turned his back on Frank, effectively erasing him from existence. "Vivian," the chief continued, turning back to her with a cold, businesslike smile, "shall we discuss the new terms of the merger in the library?" Vivian nodded, taking Silas's arm. As they walked away, leaving Frank screaming in the center of the ballroom as security dragged him toward the service exit, she didn't look back once. The worthless girl was dead. Long live the Oracle. The humiliation at the gala had stripped Frank of the last vestiges of his sanity. He was a man drowning, and in his mind, the only way to stay afloat was to pull Vivian down with him. He retreated to a dimly lit internet cafe in a derelict part of the city, his fingers flying across a sticky keyboard. He still had one card to play, or so he thought. Before the wedding, Frank had secretly recorded a series of private conversations and confessions Vivian had made about her father's illegal offshore maneuvers and the hidden backdoors in the Nigerian government's financial software. It was the blackmail file, a digital kill switch he'd kept as insurance. He sent a single, encrypted message to Silas Vane's private server. "I have the recordings, the ones that send your Oracle and her father to a Nigerian federal prison for life. 20 million USD in Monero, or the files go to the Interpol tip line in 1 hour. Don't test me." In the Vane penthouse, Vivian watched the message pop up on her secondary monitor. She didn't flinch. Silas, standing behind her with a glass of scotch, leaned in. "He's persistent, I'll give him that. Does he actually have anything?" "He has shadows of the truth," Vivian said, her eyes narrowing as she began a trace. "Data I shared with him when I still thought he was my partner. It's enough to cause a scandal that could tank the merger." "Shall I send someone to end this?" Silas asked, his voice dropping into a lethal register. "No," Vivian said, a predatory smile touching her lips. I want him to think he's winning. I want him to feel the weight of the prize before it turns to lead. She typed back a short response. I'm coming alone to the old shipyard, Pier 42. I have the drive with the funds. If you release the files, the money vanishes. No police, no Silas. Frank's heart leaped. He had done it. He had finally cracked the oracle. An hour later, the fog at Pier 42 was thick, smelling of salt and rusted iron. Frank stood in the center of an empty warehouse, clutching his laptop like a shield. When the headlights of a single black SUV cut through the mist, he straightened his crumpled collar. Vivian stepped out of the car. She wasn't wearing the gold and silk of the gala. She was in a sharp, black tactical trench coat, her face cold and unreadable. She held up a high-capacity hardware wallet. The files, Frank, all of them, she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. Money first, Vive, Frank sneered, emboldened by her apparent surrender. You always thought you were so much smarter than me, but look who's begging now. I'm not begging, Frank. I'm negotiating a burial, she replied. She tossed the wallet toward him. It skittered across the concrete, stopping at his feet. Frank grabbed it, plugging it into his laptop with shaking hands. Yes, it's all here, 20 million, he laughed, a manic, jagged sound. You're free, Vivian, go back to your Mafia King. I'm going to be the one who. Suddenly, his laptop screen began to glitch. The 20 million figure began to count down fast. 15 million, 5 million, 0. What? No, what did you do? Frank screamed, hitting the keys. It's a smart contract, Frank, Vivian said, stepping closer. The funds are only released if the recipient's IP address doesn't match a known database of flagged blackmailers. The moment you access the wallet, it triggered a proof of crime protocol I wrote this morning. The warehouse lights suddenly flared to life, blinding him. From the shadows, not Silas's men, but 4 stone-faced agents in jackets labeled Interpol stepped forward. Frank Adami, the lead agent said, we have a recorded confession of you attempting to extort a foreign dignitary and admitting to the theft of sovereign financial data. You sent the evidence to our tip line yourself 10 minutes ago. Frank looked at his laptop in horror. The blackmail file hadn't gone to Silas. Vivian had rerouted his send command. He had turned himself in. You set me up, Frank whimpered as the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Vivian stood over him, looking down with a chilling indifference. I didn't set you up, Frank. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself. You called me worthless, but it turns out your freedom was the only thing with no value at all. As they dragged him away, screaming about his father and his rights, Vivian turned her back on the noise, walking back into the fog where Silas was waiting in the shadows. The fallout of the shipyard arrest was instantaneous. By morning, the name Frank Adami was a toxin in the international business community. In Nigeria, the scandal threatened to pull the legendary Adami group into the abyss. 3 days later, the atmosphere in Silas's private study was stifling. Chief Adami sat in a heavy velvet chair, his face a mask of weary iron. He had spent 40 years building a legacy that his only son had nearly gambled away in 40 nights. Across from him sat Vivian, the woman he had once seen as a mere political bridge, now the only person holding the keys to his company's survival. He is in a federal holding cell, the chief said, his voice gravelly. He begs for lawyers. He begs for me to pay his bail. And will you? Vivian asked, her voice calm, devoid of the malice the chief expected. The chief looked at Silas, who was standing by the window, a silent guardian. Then he looked back at Vivian. He saw the way she carried herself, not as a victim of a gambler, but as a sovereign ruler. I did not raise a fool, the chief said, but I allowed one to carry my name. I see now that the strength of our houses never resided in the blood of my son. It was in the woman I was foolish enough to treat as an object of trade. He pulled a heavy, wax-sealed mahogany box from his robe. Inside was a legal document that would shock the Nigerian consulate. I am officially removing Frank from the Adami lineage, the chief announced. He will be stripped of his name, his shares, and his inheritance. In the eyes of Nigerian law and my board of directors, he is dead. He pushed the papers toward Vivian. I am nomming you my successor. You will hold the chair of the Lagos LA merger. You will be the head of the house in America. My son gambled you away, Vivian, but in doing so, he handed the keys of the kingdom to the only person capable of reigning. Vivian looked at the documents. The submissive daughter would have wept with gratitude. The oracle simply picked up a pen. There is one condition, father, Vivian said, the title father, now a term of business rather than daughterly affection. Name it, the chief replied. Frank remains in that cell until his trial. No private jets to Lagos. No accidental disappearances. He must face the reality of a world where he has no currency. The chief nodded slowly. He is no longer my concern. He is yours. As the chief left, Silas walked over and placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder. You just won the biggest pot of your life, Vivian. How does it feel? Vivian looked at the signature on the page, her name, written in bold, certain strokes. It feels like the dice finally stopped rolling. The underbelly looked different when you weren't the one being sold. To Vivian, the air no longer felt toxic. It felt fragile. She walked through the velvet curtains of the private high-stakes room, the clicking of her heels on the hardwood sounding like the ticking of a clock. Frank was waiting for her, but he wasn't sitting at the table. He was slumped in a chair in the corner, flanked by two of Silas's enforcers. He was a ghost of the man who had walked in weeks ago. His designer suit was stained, his hair matted, and his eyes held the hollow, flickering light of a candle about to go out. Vivian, he rasped, his voice breaking. You came, you talked to my father, he's coming for me, right? He's clearing the charges. Vivian didn't answer. She sat at the center of the baccarat table, the very spot where Silas had sat when he changed her life. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the 2 ivory dice. She set them on the green felt with a soft clack. I talked to the chief, Vivian said, her voice cool and steady. He isn't coming, Frank. He's already signed the papers. You've been disowned. In the eyes of your family, you don't exist. Frank's face contorted. No, he wouldn't. He needs me. I'm his son. You were his burden, Vivian corrected. She leaned forward, the light of the overhead lamp casting sharp shadows across her cheekbones. You told this room I was worthless. You told Silas I was a spark to be traded. So I decided to give you what you always wanted. One last gamble. Frank's eyes locked onto the dice. The old addiction flared for a second, a desperate hope for a miracle. What's the bet? You roll, Vivian said. If you roll a 7 or higher, I'll use my influence to get the Interpol charges dropped. You'll be free to walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on your back. No name, no money, but free. Frank's breath hitched. And if I lose? If you lose, Vivian's voice turned to ice, you go to trial, and I will make sure the prosecutors see every single transaction, every skimmed dollar, and every betrayal you've ever committed. You will spend 20 years in a cell thinking about the worthless girl who put you there. Frank reached for the dice, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. He looked at her, searching for a trace of the submissive wife who used to cook his meals and endure his insults. He found nothing but a reflection of his own ruin. He threw. The dice skipped across the felt, a 4 and a 2. 6. The silence that followed was absolute. Frank stared at the numbers, his mouth hanging open. No, that's not fair. I was so close. Vivian, please, one more, just one more. Vivian stood up, smoothing the front of her black coat. She didn't look at the dice. She looked at the man who had tried to sell her soul. The house always wins, Frank, she whispered, and I am the house. She turned and walked toward the door where Silas was waiting. As the enforcers moved in to take Frank to the waiting transport, his screams echoed through the underbelly, but they didn't reach her. She was already thinking about the morning. The sun rose over the Pacific, bleeding hues of violet and gold across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vane headquarters. The office didn't feel like a place of business. It felt like a sanctuary. On the desk sat a single black lotus flower in a crystal vase, a symbol of a beauty that grows from the mud. Vivian stood at the window, watching the city wake up. In her hand, she held a final legal decree. Frank had been sentenced to 15 years in a high-security facility. The news had barely made the back pages. In the world Vivian now navigated, he was already ancient history. Her father's company had stabilized, its stock price soaring as the Oracle's algorithms modernized the Lagos trade routes. A soft click of the door announced Silas. He walked in, not with the predatory stride of a boss, but with the quiet pride of a man who had found his equal. He set a file on the desk, a partnership agreement that formally merged their empires into a single entity. "The board in Nigeria has ratified the merger," Silas said, standing beside her. "You are officially the most powerful woman in the trade corridor. How does the throne feel?" Vivian turned to him, a genuine, serene smile softening her sharp features. "It feels solid. For the first time, I'm not standing on someone else's foundation. I'm standing on my own." She looked back at the desk, where the 2 ivory dice sat, now encased in a small glass display. They were a reminder of the night she had been treated as a commodity, and the night she had chosen to become a queen. "Frank once told me I was worthless," she mused. "He thought that by losing me, he was just losing a debt. He never realized that by losing me, he lost the only person who was actually keeping the world from crushing him." Silas took her hand, his thumb grazing the gold signet ring her father had given her. A man who bets his soul usually finds out too late that he didn't have much to wager in the first place. Vivian leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. The marriage of convenience, the gambling debts, and the submissive silence were all gone. In their place was a new order. The worthless wife was the architect of a new age, and as she looked out over the horizon, Vivian knew that the dice would never have to be rolled for her freedom again. She had already won.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know when new videos drop. Lastly, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.